Naomi Fields adjusted her captain's hat as she stepped into the terminal of Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. The early morning air buzzed with the hum of rolling suitcases and last-minute boarding calls, a familiar symphony for someone who had spent decades navigating the corridors of aviation. At 45, she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned her place. But even after 22 years in the cockpit, there were still moments, small, insidious moments, that reminded her that some people refused to see her for what she was: a pilot, a leader, an equal. She glanced at her watch. 5:45 a.m. Plenty of time before pre-flight preparations for American Western Airlines Flight 447, bound for Denver. It was supposed to be a routine day: fly out, attend an FAA licensing board meeting in the afternoon, and return home before the sun dipped below the horizon. But something had been gnawing at her since she checked her email earlier that morning. Among the usual flight updates and administrative notices sat an anonymous message, its subject line stark and to the point: "They'll never let you in." She had almost ignored it, assuming it was another disgruntled passenger complaint mistakenly forwarded to her inbox. But curiosity had won. The email was brief. "Look around. You've flown more hours than most men in this airline. But where are the other captains who look like you? They're either stuck, overlooked, or gone. This system wasn't built for you. Stop trying to fix it." She had read it twice before deleting it. Anonymous. Unverifiable. Yet it lingered in the back of her mind like an old scar that refused to fade. She exhaled and squared her shoulders, pushing the thought aside. She had more pressing matters to focus on. As she strode toward the crew lounge, she felt the familiar weight of her ID badge bouncing slightly against her uniform. The polished emblem bore her name and title: Captain Naomi Fields, American Western Airlines. It was more than a piece of plastic. It was proof. Proof of the long nights, the early mornings, the constant battles to be seen as equal. The crew lounge at Gate C-42 required an access badge to enter. She reached for hers, swiped it against the scanner, and waited for the light to turn green. It didn't. Red. She frowned. That was odd. She tried again. Red. A flicker of irritation sparked in her chest. This wasn't a security issue. She had entered this lounge dozens of times before, without incident. Just as she reached for her phone to call facilities, a voice cut through the air behind her. "Can I help you?" The tone was clipped, neither welcoming nor particularly polite. Naomi turned, meeting the gaze of a middle-aged man in a navy blazer embroidered with crew management. His name tag read, Garrett Coleman. Her irritation deepened. She had dealt with men like him before, the kind who wore authority like a weapon, the kind who always seemed to have an unspoken challenge in their eyes when speaking to someone like her. "My badge isn't working," she said, keeping her voice even. "I'm Captain Fields, flying AWA 447 to Denver this morning." Garrett's eyes flickered from her face to the gold stripes on her sleeves, then down to her badge. His expression remained unreadable. "This lounge is for American Western crew members only," he said. Naomi's patience thinned. "I am American Western crew." A beat of silence. "Let me see your credentials again," he said. She handed them over, watching as he examined them longer than necessary. His fingers skimmed over her ID, her pilot's license, her certification, documents that should have left no room for doubt. A slow shake of his head. "These look irregular. I'll need to verify them." The words slithered into her skin like a slow burn. She had flown over 12,000 hours. She had led countless flights. And yet here she was, being treated like a fraud in her own workplace. A movement to her right caught her eye. Another pilot, white, male, younger, approached the door. He swiped his badge. The light flashed green, and without hesitation, Garrett stepped aside. "Morning, Captain Reynolds," he greeted, his voice noticeably warmer. Naomi felt something tighten in her chest. She took a slow breath. "Mr. Coleman," she said carefully, "I'd like to speak to your supervisor." Garrett's lips pressed into a thin line. "He's not available right now." "Then call him." A flicker of something crossed his face. Annoyance, perhaps? Maybe even amusement. "Look," he said, lowering his voice slightly, Why don't you just wait in the public area? It'll be more comfortable for everyone. The implication was clear. More comfortable for whom? Before she could respond, another voice joined the conversation. Is there a problem here? Naomi turned to see First Officer Xavier Brooks standing just a few feet away, his brows furrowed in concern. Xavier was younger, maybe late 20s, with sharp eyes that had a way of catching details others missed. She had flown with him before. He was talented, level-headed. He had also confided in her once about his struggles as a black pilot trying to move up in the ranks. Garrett's demeanor shifted, suddenly adopting a forced politeness. No problem, he said quickly. Just verifying credentials. You know, security protocols. Xavier's gaze flicked to Naomi, then back to Garrett. Sir, this is Captain Fields, Xavier said, his tone steady. She's commanding AWA 447 this morning. I'm her co-pilot. A long pause. Garrett's jaw tightened. Her credentials need additional verification. Xavier's expression hardened. I've flown with Captain Fields before, he said. She's one of the most senior pilots we have. Another pause. Garrett glanced around as if weighing his options. Naomi had had enough. She reached for her phone, opened her email, and scrolled to a familiar name. Director Linda Pearson, FAA Licensing Board. She dialed. Director Pearson, she said evenly, I'm at DFW and we have a situation requiring immediate attention. Xavier said nothing, but she could see it in his posture, the way his fingers curled slightly at his sides, the way his jaw locked. She didn't need to explain. They both knew exactly what was happening here. Naomi stood tall, phone still in hand, her fingers steady as she waited for the voice on the other end. The weight of the moment pressed against her chest, not because this was new, but because it was old, too familiar. Captain Fields, came the voice of Linda Pearson, direct and unwavering. What's going on? Naomi exhaled, keeping her tone professional but firm. I'm at DFW, Gate C42, attempting to enter the crew lounge. My credentials have been denied access. A brief pause. That makes no sense. Your certification is up to date. Yes, Naomi said, her voice level. And yet I've just watched another pilot walk in, without issue, while I'm being told my credentials need additional verification. Another pause, longer this time. Then Linda spoke, her voice clipped. Give me 10 minutes. Naomi ended the call and met Garrett Coleman's eyes. He didn't look nervous. He looked smug. You can wait in the public area until we get this sorted, he said, already looking past her as if she had become irrelevant. Naomi let out a slow breath. She could feel Xavier beside her, his tension mirroring hers. But there was something else in his expression, something heavier than just anger, recognition. He had seen this before. They both had. Mr. Coleman, Naomi said, her voice steady, let me make something clear. I am a senior captain with this airline. I have flown more hours than most pilots on your roster. And right now, I am being singled out for no reason other than your personal discretion. Garrett crossed his arms. I told you. You don't get to decide where I wait, she interrupted, her voice cutting through his. And you don't get to decide which pilots belong here. For the first time, something flickered in his eyes, a crack in his composure. Naomi turned to Xavier. First Officer Brooks, I need you to begin pre-flight checks. I'll join you shortly. Xavier hesitated, then nodded. Yes, Captain. His words were sharp, deliberate. He gave Garrett a long look before walking toward the terminal. Garrett exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. You're making a big deal out of nothing. Naomi stared at him. Then, just loud enough for him to hear, she said, You're making a mistake. She turned and walked away, the heat of indignation curling in her chest like a slow-burning flame. The walk through Terminal C felt longer than usual. Maybe it was the fluorescent lights overhead, too bright and clinical, or the weight of the stairs. Some curious, some indifferent, a few knowing. She passed a row of screens displaying departures and arrivals, her flight still showing as on time. 6:10 a.m. She had exactly 50 minutes before takeoff. She found an empty table in a quiet corner of a coffee shop near her gate. The aroma of espresso and freshly baked pastries filled the air, a stark contrast to the tension still humming in her veins. She set her phone on the table, pulled out her tablet, and opened her FAA inbox. A new email from Linda Pearson blinked at the top. Investigating now. Will escalate if necessary. Naomi closed her eyes briefly. She appreciated Linda, always had, but appreciation didn't erase exhaustion. A shadow moved across the table. You okay? She looked up. Xavier stood there, 2 cups of coffee in hand. Naomi sighed. Define okay. Xavier set one of the cups in front of her and sat down. He hesitated before speaking, his voice quieter than before. That wasn't about security. No, Naomi said, stirring her coffee. It wasn't. They sat in silence for a moment, the sound of the bustling terminal filling the spaces between them. Xavier shifted in his seat. You know, when I first started flying for AWA, I told myself that if I just kept my head down, worked hard, didn't make waves, things would get better. He exhaled a humorless laugh. Turns out it doesn't matter how good you are. Some people will always see you as someone who needs to be verified. Naomi met his gaze. So what are you going to do about it? Xavier blinked as if he hadn't expected the question to be turned on him. I don't know, he admitted, but I do know this. What happened back there? That was wrong. Naomi took a sip of her coffee, letting the warmth cut through the lingering bitterness in her chest. Then don't let it slide, she said simply. Xavier nodded. I won't. And Naomi believed him. 6:30 a.m. Naomi's phone buzzed. Linda Pearson, she answered immediately. Captain Fields, Linda said, straight to the point. I just spoke with American Western's HR department. There was no reason for your badge to be denied. Naomi wasn't surprised. And Garrett Coleman, a pause. They're claiming it was an honest mistake, that he was following protocol. Naomi let out a slow breath, gripping the edge of the table. And what's FAA's response? Another pause. Then Linda's voice came through, firmer than before. We're launching a compliance audit on AWA's hiring and promotion practices, effective immediately. Naomi straightened. That'll make waves. Good, Linda said, because this isn't just about you. We've been receiving reports, informal ones, about disparities in how certain pilots are treated. You're not the first, and I doubt you'll be the last. Naomi closed her eyes briefly. The anonymous email from earlier flashed through her mind. They'll never let you in. Maybe the sender had meant it as a warning, maybe even as a reason to give up. But Naomi wasn't built for that. Keep me updated, she said. She hung up, took the last sip of her coffee and rose to her feet. Her flight was waiting, and so was the storm she had just set in motion. Naomi walked back through the terminal, her steps steady, her mind anything but. The words from Linda Pearson echoed in her ears. Compliance audit, disparities. You're not the first. This was bigger than just her. She tightened her grip around the handle of her flight bag, pushing down the flicker of anger that threatened to rise. Stay focused. There was a flight to command, passengers to get safely to Denver. But under the surface, something sharper coiled inside her. This wasn't over. As she neared the jet bridge, Xavier was already waiting outside the cockpit, flipping through a pre-flight checklist. He glanced up as she approached. Everything good? For now. He studied her for a moment, but didn't press. Good. There were things she couldn't say yet. Not until she knew exactly what she was up against. She stepped into the cockpit, the hum of the controls welcoming her like an old friend. Familiar. Steady. Here, there were no politics, no biases, just numbers, dials, and precision. This was her space. She ran through her own set of checks, hands moving on autopilot. A few moments later, the flight crew finished boarding, and the door sealed shut. The weight of the day ahead lingered, but Naomi pushed it aside. She turned to Xavier. Let's get this bird in the air. 30 minutes into the flight. At cruising altitude, the cockpit was calm, the Denver skyline still a distant thought beyond the clouds. Naomi leaned back slightly, her fingers resting near the throttle as Xavier adjusted a setting on the autopilot. Then a sharp ping broke the silence. A message flashed across the cockpit monitor. A priority transmission from American Western Operations Control. Xavier frowned. That's unusual. Naomi tapped the screen. A message filled the display. Captain Fields, report to headquarters upon arrival. Mandatory debrief. Xavier let out a slow breath. That's not a routine request. No, it's not. She had expected a reaction from AWA, but this was fast. Too fast. Xavier hesitated. You think this is about earlier? Naomi didn't answer immediately. She didn't have to. His fingers tapped lightly against the throttle. If it were me, he said carefully, I'd say this feels like retaliation. She met his gaze. He wasn't wrong. The airline was already moving, trying to get ahead of whatever was coming. The question was, how far were they willing to go? Naomi barely had time to breathe after landing in Denver before the summons came through again. Captain Fields, please report to AWA headquarters immediately. No explanation, no details. Just an expectation. Drop everything and come. She exhaled slowly, glancing at Xavier, who had caught the message on his own system. He raised an eyebrow. They're not wasting time. No, they're not. Xavier hesitated before speaking again. Want me to come with you? Naomi shook her head. I need you to handle post-flight checks. I'll deal with this. He nodded, but his expression said something else. This isn't right. Neither of them said it out loud, but they both knew. This wasn't just a debrief. This was something else. To the AWA headquarters, Denver. The walk through AWA's corporate offices felt sterile. Clean walls, modern lighting, but an unmistakable weight in the air. Naomi had been here before, but this time was different. This time, she wasn't just another captain walking in for routine paperwork. This time, she was a problem. A woman at the front desk barely looked up before directing her to conference room 5A. The door was closed. Naomi knocked once before stepping in. Inside, 3 men in suits sat waiting. No one from flight operations. No one she actually worked with. Just legal. The man in the center, a gray-haired executive type, folded his hands neatly on the table. Captain Fields, please have a seat. She didn't. I was told this was a debrief. His lips curled slightly. It is. Funny, I don't see my chief pilot in here, or anyone from operations. The man to his left, younger, thinner, adjusted his tie. This is more of a corporate matter. There it was. The shift. Naomi's jaw tightened. Then let's not waste time. The gray-haired man, she recognized him now. Mark Calloway, VP of Corporate Affairs, leaned back. Captain, there's been some concern about your conduct today. Naomi didn't flinch. Be specific. Calloway's gaze was measured, rehearsed. We understand there was a situation at DFW regarding access to the crew lounge. That's one way to put it. We reviewed the reports, and it seems there was some confusion regarding protocol. Mr. Coleman was simply following standard security measures. Naomi let out a short, humorless laugh. Is that what we're calling it? The younger man cleared his throat. Captain Fields, this isn't disciplinary. We're just what? Naomi's voice stayed even, but her patience was razor thin. Because from where I'm standing, this doesn't look like a routine discussion. This looks like an attempt to make me quiet down before this turns into something bigger. A beat of silence. Then Calloway smiled. The kind of corporate smile designed to make you feel like you were overreacting. There's no need to escalate anything, he said smoothly. We simply want to ensure we're all on the same page. Naomi crossed her arms. Are we? Another silence. Calloway sighed, shifting tactics. Look, Captain Fields, AWA values diversity. We pride ourselves on an inclusive work environment. But public disputes, especially ones that gain attention, can be distracting. We'd hate for this to turn into something unnecessary. There it was, the warning. Naomi held his gaze. You're asking me to drop it. We're asking you to be reasonable, Calloway corrected. We understand you've spoken to the FAA, and we'd like to handle this internally. No need for outside involvement. Naomi exhaled slowly. They were nervous. That meant they knew exactly what had happened back in that lounge. And if they were nervous, it meant they had something to lose. She set her hands on the table, leaning forward just slightly. Mr. Calloway, I have nearly 25 years in this industry. I know what's reasonable and what's not. Being denied access to a crew lounge that I've used for years, while my white colleagues walk in without issue? That's not reasonable. That's a problem. Calloway's jaw tightened, but he kept his corporate mask intact. We're offering you a solution. No, you're offering me silence. A heavy pause. The younger man shifted uncomfortably. Calloway studied her for a long moment before exhaling. We'd like you to take a few days off. Paid leave. Let things settle. Naomi smiled. And when I come back, what changes? Calloway's silence told her everything. She stood. Keep your paid leave. Calloway frowned. Captain Fields, she turned toward the door. You don't want this to escalate? Then fix it. Not by sending me home, by making sure it doesn't happen again. She walked out before they could say another word. Her hands were steady. Her heart wasn't. She had just made herself a target. Naomi stepped out of the conference room, her pulse steady but her mind racing. She knew what had just happened. That wasn't a meeting, it was a warning. A quiet attempt to push her aside, to make her rethink whether this fight was worth the trouble. She'd seen it before. The soft, practiced language of corporate politics. Let things settle. We want to be reasonable. A few days off. They weren't trying to fix anything. They were trying to contain it. She moved through the sleek hallways of AWA's headquarters, past executives who barely looked up from their phones, past flight crew members who cast quick glances but said nothing. By the time she reached the exit, she had made her decision. She pulled out her phone and dialed Linda Pearson. The call connected almost immediately. Captain Fields. I just left a meeting at AWA headquarters, Naomi said, stepping onto the curb where a rideshare car was waiting. It wasn't about resolving anything. They want me to stand down. A pause. That's what I was afraid of, Linda said. I assume they're offering you a quiet exit. A paid one. Linda sighed. Figures. Naomi slid into the back seat, shutting the door. I'm not taking it. Another pause, this time shorter. Good, because I need to tell you something. Naomi adjusted in her seat. Go on. Linda's tone sharpened. I was digging into AWA's compliance records. Something's off. Over the past 3 years, at least 8 formal complaints related to hiring and promotions have been filed internally. None of them made it to the FAA. Naomi's stomach tightened. They buried them. Looks that way. And here's the kicker. Every single one was made by either a black pilot or a female pilot. Naomi closed her eyes for a brief moment. She had suspected discrimination ran deeper in AWA's leadership, but this was systemic. When did you find this? She asked. This morning. I wanted to confirm before saying anything. Naomi's jaw clenched. Send me everything you have. Linda hesitated. Fields, if you move forward with this, if you go public, it's not just your job at stake. They'll come after you. Naomi exhaled, looking out at the Denver skyline. They already have. Denver International Airport. Crew lounge. Xavier was waiting when Naomi arrived, his arms crossed as he leaned against the counter near the coffee station. He spotted her and gave a small nod. How bad? She set her flight bag down. They want me to disappear for a few days and forget this ever happened. His jaw tightened. That's not happening. No, she agreed. It's not. Xavier shifted, rubbing the back of his neck. So, what now? Naomi looked at him. He was young, but he wasn't naive. He had been in this industry long enough to understand how these things went and how quickly they could destroy careers. But he was still asking, still choosing to stand with her. She exhaled. Linda dug up compliance records. Turns out AWA has been covering up discrimination complaints for years. Xavier's eyebrows lifted slightly. Years? Years, she confirmed. I'm not the first. I won't be the last. He let out a slow breath. Okay, that's huge. It is. He studied her for a moment before speaking again. You're taking this all the way, aren't you? Are you? She countered. Xavier hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, I think I am. Naomi nodded, the weight of the moment settling between them. Then let's get to work. The weight of it all settled over Naomi like an approaching storm. She wasn't just standing up for herself anymore. This was bigger. It was about every pilot who had been overlooked, every career that had been stalled, every silent battle fought behind closed doors. She had made her choice. Now she needed to be ready for the consequences. Denver International Airport, pre-flight briefing room. Naomi and Xavier sat in a quiet briefing room, the hum of airport activity muffled by thick walls. A tablet sat on the table between them, open to the compliance reports Linda had sent. Xavier ran a hand over his face as he scrolled through the documents. 8 complaints, and not one of them made it out of AWA. Not officially, Naomi corrected. That doesn't mean people haven't been talking. Xavier glanced at her. You think some of these pilots would be willing to speak up? Naomi exhaled. I don't know, but if we're going to do this, we need more than just my story. A long silence stretched between them. Then Xavier sat back, crossing his arms. All right, what's the plan? Naomi gave him a measured look. You don't have to be in this, Brooks. You know that, right? He let out a dry laugh. You really think I can just look the other way now? She studied him, then nodded. First, she said, we find the other pilots. FAA headquarters, Washington, D.C. Linda Pearson closed the door to her office, her mind racing. She had been in this business long enough to recognize a cover-up when she saw one, but this one ran deep. She scrolled through her messages, stopping at one from an anonymous source inside AWA's legal department. Internal discussion today about limiting FAA's access to hiring records. Possible data purge incoming. Linda's stomach twisted. They were trying to destroy evidence. She grabbed her phone and dialed Naomi. As soon as the call connected, she said, We have a problem. Denver, Naomi's apartment. Naomi paced her small living room, Xavier sitting nearby, watching her with a furrowed brow. They're moving fast, Linda continued on speakerphone. If they scrub their records, it's going to be our word against theirs. Naomi stopped. What do we need? Linda sighed. Something concrete, something that proves they've been deliberately suppressing complaints. If we can get that, they won't be able to bury this. Naomi turned to Xavier. Who do we know in AWA's HR department? Xavier hesitated, then his expression shifted. I might know someone. Naomi nodded. Then it's time to make a call. Xavier tapped his fingers against his phone, his eyes flickering between hesitation and determination. He knew exactly who to call. Ben Harper, a mid-level HR specialist at AWA. Ben wasn't the kind of guy to make waves. He kept his head down, followed the rules, and made sure to avoid office politics. But Xavier also knew something else. Ben didn't believe in covering up wrongdoing. He hit the call button. The line rang twice before Ben picked up. Xavier, his voice was cautious. Hey, Ben, I need to ask you something. Off the record. A pause, then quietly. This about Fields? Xavier exchanged a glance with Naomi. Yeah. Ben exhaled. I can't talk about this on the phone. Then meet us, Xavier pressed. We just need to know the truth. Silence, then finally. Fine, but not anywhere public. My place. Tonight. Xavier nodded. We'll be there. Ben Harper's apartment, Denver. The tension in the air was thick as Naomi and Xavier sat across from Ben in his modest living room. He looked nervous, like someone who knew he was about to cross a line he could never uncross. I don't know how much I can give you, Ben started, rubbing his hands together. But I do know what's happening in that office isn't right. Naomi leaned forward. They're covering up complaints. Ben nodded. Yeah, and not just ignoring them, they're actively burying them. Pilots have been reporting issues for years, but instead of those complaints making it to FAA oversight, they get handled internally. Handled? Xavier asked. Ben sighed. Either the pilots who file complaints get reassigned to less desirable routes, or their evaluations suddenly start showing performance concerns. Enough of those, and their promotions stall out. Naomi's stomach tightened. They're retaliating. Ben nodded. And it's systematic. I've seen internal emails, conversations about maintaining the culture and ensuring consistency in leadership. Naomi exchanged a glance with Xavier. They both knew exactly what that meant. Do you have copies? Naomi asked. Ben hesitated. Not legally. Xavier leaned forward. Ben, if they're erasing records, we need something concrete before it's gone forever. Ben exhaled, rubbing his temples. I have access to archives, but if I pull those files and they find out, he trailed off. Naomi's voice softened. You're not alone in this, but if we don't stop it now, how many more pilots get pushed out? Ben swallowed hard, then nodded. I'll get the files. Ben Harper sat hunched over his laptop, the dim glow of the screen casting shadows across his tired face. The tension in his small apartment was thick, the weight of what he was about to do pressing down on him like a vice. Naomi and Xavier sat across from him, watching silently as he navigated AWA's internal system. Ben exhaled sharply. All right, I'm in. Naomi leaned forward. What exactly are we looking for? Ben's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Any documentation that proves complaints were intentionally buried. Internal memos, deleted reports, flagged emails, anything that shows this wasn't just an oversight. His hands moved quickly, typing commands, bypassing access restrictions, with an ease that made it clear he had spent more time in these archives than he should have. Then suddenly he froze. Xavier frowned. What? Ben's face paled. They've already started erasing things. Naomi's heart kicked against her ribs. How much? Ben swallowed. A lot. Whole complaint files are missing. It's like they never existed. Xavier let out a curse under his breath. They're covering their tracks. Ben scrolled faster, his eyes scanning line after line of metadata. Then he stopped. His voice barely above a whisper, he muttered, Wait, not everything's gone. Naomi and Xavier leaned in. Ben clicked on a buried folder labeled Non-Action Reports, a digital graveyard for complaints that had been quietly discarded. A long list appeared. Naomi's stomach turned. Dozens of names, complaints marked as resolved internally or simply no further action required. She clicked on one, then another, and another. Each told a different version of the same story. A black first officer denied a promotion despite exceeding all qualifications. A female pilot reassigned after reporting inappropriate behavior from a senior captain. A veteran pilot with years of experience suddenly given poor performance reviews after speaking out about discrimination. The pattern was undeniable. Ben turned to them. This is what they didn't want you to see. Naomi's hands curled into fists. We need to get this to the FAA. Now. Ben hesitated. If they find out I pulled these, Naomi met his gaze. We'll protect you, but we can't let them erase this. Ben stared at the screen for a long moment. Then with a determined nod, he started downloading the files. The war had just escalated. The progress bar inched forward on Ben's laptop, the quiet hum of the machine, the only sound filling the cramped apartment. Naomi and Xavier watched in tense silence as the download neared completion. Ben exhaled sharply. Almost there. Just a few more minutes. Naomi's mind raced. This wasn't just evidence. It was proof. Hard, undeniable proof that AWA had been bearing complaints, manipulating careers, and maintaining a system that kept certain pilots like her and Xavier, from advancing. She had known discrimination existed. She had felt it. But seeing it spelled out in black and white, in official company records, made her chest tighten with something sharper than anger. It was rage. Xavier tapped his fingers against the table. How do we get this to the FAA without tipping AWA off? Naomi straightened. We don't send it through regular channels. Not yet. We take it straight to Linda Pearson in person. Ben hesitated. That's risky. Naomi's jaw tightened. So is doing nothing. A soft ding signaled the download was complete. Ben quickly transferred the files onto an encrypted USB drive and handed it to Naomi. This is everything, he said. Emails, internal memos, altered performance reviews. If this gets out, AWA won't be able to explain it away. Naomi took the drive, gripping it tightly. Then let's make sure it does. Denver International Airport. Terminal parking lot. The night air was crisp, the distant hum of airplanes taking off and landing, blending with the faint rustle of wind through the lot. Naomi leaned against the hood of her car, her fingers still wrapped around the USB drive in her pocket. Xavier stood nearby, arms crossed. When do we leave for D.C.? Naomi glanced at her phone. First flight out in the morning. He let out a slow breath. They're going to come after you for this. Naomi met his gaze. They already have. Xavier nodded, then glanced toward the terminal. You think Ben will be okay? Naomi exhaled. I don't know, but he made his choice. Just like we did. A beat of silence stretched between them. Then Xavier spoke, his voice lower. We're about to start something we can't take back, aren't we? Naomi's grip on the USB tightened. Yeah, we are. And deep down she knew, once this was out, nothing would ever be the same. The early morning sky over Denver was still painted in hues of deep blue and gray when Naomi and Xavier arrived at the airport. Their flight to Washington, D.C. was set to depart in less than an hour, and despite the routine of checking in and moving through security, the tension between them was unmistakable. Naomi kept a hand in her pocket, her fingers brushing against the small USB drive. The evidence that could shatter American Western Airlines. She knew they weren't just carrying documents, they were carrying a bomb. As they reached their gate, Xavier let out a slow breath. Think they know yet? Naomi shook her head. Not yet, but they will soon. As if on cue, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Her eyes flickered to Xavier before answering. Fields. A moment of silence. Then a voice she recognized too well. Captain Fields, you should reconsider your next steps. Garrett Coleman. Her grip tightened around the phone. Funny, Garrett. You didn't seem this concerned when you were blocking me from the crew lounge. Let's not make this personal, he said smoothly. You're making a mistake. Naomi's jaw clenched. The only mistake would be letting this go. Garrett sighed. Do you have any idea what you're doing? You think the FAA is just going to throw their full weight behind you? You think AWA is going to let this happen? She could feel Xavier shift beside her, listening intently. Naomi kept her voice calm. I think AWA has been getting away with this for too long, and I think you're nervous. A pause. Then Garrett chuckled, low and condescending. You're not the first one to fight back, Captain. But let me remind you, none of them are here anymore. The call ended. Xavier swore under his breath. That was a threat. Naomi exhaled. That was fear. She pocketed her phone and straightened. Come on, we have a flight to catch. They boarded in silence, the weight of what they were about to do heavier than ever. And as the plane lifted into the sky, Naomi knew. This was it, the point of no return. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, but Naomi barely heard it. As the plane climbed, leveling out above the clouds, she stared at the seat in front of her, her mind running through every possible outcome of what they were about to do. Xavier shifted beside her. That call back there, they wouldn't actually do anything, right? Naomi didn't answer immediately. She wanted to tell him this was just corporate posturing, that AWA wouldn't risk making things worse. But she knew better. People like Garrett don't make threats unless they think they have power, she said finally. Right now they think we're still playing by their rules. Xavier exhaled, rubbing his hands together. And we're not. Naomi turned her head slightly. Not anymore. They sat in silence for a while. Then Naomi's phone vibrated again. Another unknown number. She hesitated this time. Then slowly she swiped to decline the call. A second later, a text message popped up. Turn back. This is bigger than you. She clenched her jaw and shut off the screen. More threats? Xavier asked. Something like that. Then they're scared. Naomi gave a small nod. Yeah, and scared people do desperate things. FAA headquarters, Washington, D.C. By the time they landed at Reagan National Airport, the tension in Naomi's chest had hardened into something sharp. The air was thick with the humidity of the East Coast summer, but she barely noticed as she and Xavier pushed through the crowd toward their waiting rideshare. Linda Pearson had sent them a message earlier with an address, a secure meeting location outside the FAA's main offices. Naomi understood why. If AWA had people watching, meeting at headquarters would be too obvious. They climbed into the car, the city flashing by in streaks of movement. Xavier tapped his fingers against the seat. You think Linda's ready for this? Naomi let out a slow breath. I think she knows what's coming. The question is, how much pushback is she willing to take? They pulled up to a nondescript office building in Arlington, a few blocks away from the FAA headquarters. Linda was already waiting inside a private conference room, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She looked up as they entered. "Tell me you have something solid." Naomi pulled out the USB drive and set it on the table. "This is everything they've been hiding." Linda picked it up, turning it between her fingers before exhaling. "All right," she said. "Let's see just how deep this rabbit hole goes." Linda Pearson plugged the USB drive into her laptop, her fingers moving with quiet precision as she pulled up the files. Naomi and Xavier sat across from her, watching as rows of documents, emails, and suppressed complaints filled the screen. Linda's expression didn't change, but Naomi could see the flicker of something behind her eyes. Recognition. Disgust. "This is worse than I thought," Linda muttered, scrolling through the flagged reports. "These aren't just ignored complaints. AWA actively manipulated records. Pilots were blacklisted. Performance reviews were doctored. And this..." She clicked on an internal email thread labeled Leadership Strategy, Culture Preservation. Naomi leaned in as Linda skimmed through the messages. "Garrett Coleman, we need to be selective about who moves up. Our passengers expect a certain level of professionalism and familiarity. We can't just check boxes." Richard Vaughn, CEO. "Understood. Let's handle this quietly. Performance-based reviews should be enough to keep the right balance." Xavier exhaled sharply. They were saying it outright. Naomi's stomach churned. They weren't even hiding it. They knew exactly what they were doing. Linda closed her laptop and sat back. "This changes everything. If we take this to the right people, AWA won't just face fines. They could lose their operating license." Naomi met her gaze. "Then let's move." Linda hesitated. "It's not that simple. AWA has influence, connections. The FAA has to tread carefully, or this could turn into a political nightmare." Naomi's voice hardened. "People lost their careers over this. We don't tread carefully. We bring the whole thing down." Linda studied her for a long moment. Then finally she nodded. "All right, I'll start making calls." Naomi sat back, the weight of what they had just set in motion pressing against her chest. This was it, the moment they pushed AWA into freefall. Naomi and Xavier sat in tense silence as Linda made the first call. The small conference room felt even smaller as the weight of what they were doing settled between them. "Director," Linda said into her phone, her voice steady, "I have something you need to see. It's bigger than we thought." She listened for a moment, then nodded. "I understand. I'll be there in 30. Ending the call, she turned to Naomi and Xavier. "That was Robert Phillips, head of regulatory oversight at the FAA. He's agreed to review the evidence. But we have to move carefully. AWA is already on edge." Naomi frowned. "You think they know?" Linda exhaled sharply. "I think they suspect. And if they do, they'll do everything in their power to stop this from going public." Xavier ran a hand over his face. "So what do we do?" Linda's voice was firm. "We make sure there's no way to bury this." FAA Headquarters, Regulatory Oversight Office. Robert Phillips was a man who had seen enough corruption in his career to recognize when something stank. As soon as he plugged in the USB and skimmed through the first few emails, his lips pressed into a tight line. "This is damning," he muttered. Naomi and Xavier exchanged a glance. Phillips leaned back in his chair. "If what I'm seeing here is accurate, AWA isn't just facing fines. This is a violation of federal labor and anti-discrimination laws. We're talking criminal charges." Linda nodded. "That's why we came to you first. We need the FAA to step in before they can cover this up any further." Phillips exhaled. "I can initiate an emergency audit, but that's not enough. We need outside pressure. The Department of Justice, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, someone with real legal weight." Naomi's stomach tightened. "And how do we make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug?" Phillips looked at her. "We take it public." A silence fell over the room. Linda tapped her fingers against the table. "You mean media?" Phillips nodded. "You're holding a bomb. You need to detonate it before AWA finds a way to defuse it." Xavier let out a slow breath. "So we're blowing this wide open?" Naomi met Phillips's gaze. "Then let's make some noise." Naomi sat in the back of a cab, gripping her phone tightly as the city blurred past her. The stakes had shifted. This wasn't just about pushing the FAA to act anymore. It was about forcing the world to watch. Xavier sat beside her, scrolling through his contacts. If we're going public, we need the right journalist. Someone who won't get scared off when AWA starts throwing their legal team at them. Naomi nodded. Who do you have in mind? Xavier's thumb hovered over a name before tapping the call button. The line rang twice before a sharp, familiar voice answered. Brooks, didn't expect to hear from you. Xavier smiled slightly. Didn't expect to be making this call, Morgan. Naomi recognized the name. Morgan Tate, investigative journalist, known for taking down corporate giants. Morgan's voice was casual, but Naomi could hear the curiosity beneath it. So what's AWA trying to hide? Xavier met Naomi's gaze. Enough to bring them down. A beat of silence. Then Morgan said, I'm listening. Washington, D.C. Undisclosed meeting spot. Morgan was waiting at a quiet cafe tucked away from the usual political crowd. She was younger than Naomi expected, but the sharp focus in her eyes told her why she had a reputation for breaking stories others were too afraid to touch. All right, Morgan said, flipping open her notebook. Tell me what you've got. Naomi slid the USB drive across the table. This is everything. Buried complaints, retaliation against pilots, emails straight from the top. Morgan plugged it into her laptop, her eyes scanning the first few documents. Her lips parted slightly as she read through an internal memo. Wow, she muttered. They weren't even subtle. No, Naomi said, voice firm. They weren't. Morgan looked up. Once I publish this, AWA will deny everything. They'll attack your credibility. They'll say you're bitter, that you're making this personal. Naomi held her gaze. It is personal. Morgan studied her for a moment, then nodded. Good. That means you're ready for what's coming. She snapped her laptop shut. Let's make some headlines. The article hit the internet at 6:30 a.m. sharp. By 7:15 a.m., it was already trending. By 9 a.m., American Western Airlines was in full-blown crisis mode. Naomi scrolled through her phone, watching as the headlines multiplied across news sites and social media feeds. AWA accused of systemic discrimination. Whistleblower reveals internal cover-ups. Buried complaints, doctored reviews, FAA to investigate AWA hiring practices. They made sure we couldn't succeed. Black pilots speak out against AWA. She exhaled slowly. It was happening. Across the table, Xavier tapped at his screen. You seeing this? Naomi nodded. They can't ignore it now. Morgan had done her job well. The article wasn't just a scandal, it was a reckoning. It included direct quotes from whistleblowers, internal memos, and the suppressed complaints that had been buried for years. Even better, it wasn't just one article. The story had spread. National networks were picking it up. Experts were already being interviewed. Public outrage was growing. Then Naomi's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Linda Pearson. She answered immediately. Tell me you have news. Linda's voice was clipped, but there was an edge of satisfaction. FAA just announced an emergency investigation into AWA, effective immediately. Naomi closed her eyes for a brief second. They had done it. Then Linda added, and Vaughn's in freefall. Their board is calling an emergency meeting. Naomi's eyes snapped open. AWA's CEO, Richard Vaughn, the man who had signed off on every buried complaint, every career sabotage, was losing control. She looked at Xavier. Vaughn's cornered, she said. He's going to fight back. Xavier's jaw tightened. Then we don't stop. Naomi nodded. She wasn't finished. Not yet. Richard Vaughn sat in his private office at AWA headquarters, his hands steepled as he stared at the television screen. Every major news outlet had picked up the story. The footage of pilots, his pilots, speaking out against the company, played in an endless loop. The phone on his desk buzzed for the 6th time in the last 10 minutes. He didn't answer. He already knew what the board wanted. Fix this. Now the problem was, he couldn't. He had controlled this narrative for years. The quiet firings, the stalled promotions, the pilots who just disappeared from the system when they became inconvenient. But now the world was watching, and Garrett Coleman had vanished. Vaughn clenched his jaw. Garrett had been his point man, the one who handled the problems. If he was missing, that meant he was flipping. A new wave of anger rolled through Vaughn. Then his office door burst open. It was Marcus Chen, AWA's chief of operations. His face was pale, his tie slightly loosened. He looked shaken. "We have a problem," Marcus said, his voice tight. Vaughn exhaled sharply. "No kidding." "No, I mean a bigger problem," Marcus snapped. He tossed a folder onto Vaughn's desk. "The FAA just grounded 3 of our aircraft in Chicago. Maintenance violations." Vaughn's stomach turned. If FAA was digging into maintenance, that meant this wasn't just about hiring practices anymore. They were going for blood. His phone buzzed again. This time he picked up. "Mr. Vaughn," came the voice on the other end, his legal counsel. "You need to step down." The words sent a sharp chill down his spine. "Excuse me?" "The board is voting in the next hour," the lawyer continued. "They need a sacrifice, and you're it." Vaughn's grip tightened around the phone. "Absolutely not. Richard, listen to me. The DOJ is considering fraud charges if it turns out AWA misrepresented safety compliance. FAA is going after your license. You can either resign and negotiate a deal, or you can go down with the company." Vaughn's pulse pounded in his ears. They were really doing this, after everything he had done for them. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then finally, he laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Fine," he said, his voice ice cold. "Let them vote." If AWA was going to fall, he wasn't going down alone. FAA headquarters, press conference room. Naomi stood at the back of the crowded room, arms crossed as the FAA spokesperson stepped up to the podium. "Effective immediately," the woman announced, "American Western Airlines is under full federal investigation." The room erupted in noise. Reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing. Naomi exhaled. Xavier nudged her. "We did it." Naomi didn't smile. Not yet, because this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the real fight. She had torn the old system down. Now she had to build something better.